All right, so let's jump on into this thing, the Gospel of Thomas, the twin. We talked about the twin last time, Didymus, which also meant the twin. So he was Thomas Didymus, so he was the twin. He was double. Again, we don't know if that was just them having little word play with the name, or some folks speculated that Thomas was actually a twin, literal of Jesus, a twin brother. And some say that was more of a spiritual thing, that their gospel, their theology, their thinking, their spirituality, and their approach to their life was a twin. Uh, so, how old is this thing? There's one simple answer. I don't know. We don't know. Je ne sais. This version, however, was compiled by some unknown scribe for some unknown purpose and was buried in a clay jar almost 2,000 years ago for some unknown reason. We can speculate pretty good on it, but we don't have conclusive, what they say in the criminal court, beyond the shadow of a doubt type of proof for any of it. But we do have that civil court level of, we have a pretty good circumstantial case based on the preponderance of evidence. So just like with OJ, they couldn't convict him criminally, but they found him liable civilly. So there are two different standards in those two different proceedings. Based on that evidence, it's most likely that this version is from somewhere in the late 1st or 2nd century, which makes it pretty close to the actual time of Jesus, because, Jesus was 33 when he died. So that's already AD 33 right there. And so if you're in that 1st century, that only leaves you about 70 something more years. And again, you got to take into account the fact that they were with him, many of his contemporaries. And when he said, or there was about him returning, some of them didn't know if that was going to be in the next week, the next month, the next year. So there was no real demand to put any of this stuff down to document it. So being from the 1st century or the late 1st century, early 2nd century is still relatively close to that time of Jesus. We know that this particular, what they call it, a codice, was it's a leather bound. It was leather bound with some really high quality papyrus in it. Was physically put together probably around the 4th century, and likely buried shortly after that Nicene conference when they met together, and the Emperor Constantine said, "We're going to make this the official religion of the Roman Empire. We're going to convert everybody, whether you were pagan, whether you were agnostic, whether you believe this or that. We're going to pull it all together and make everybody a Christian, and we're going to put our official stamp on it." But there's some things that I don't want you guys reading, some older texts, some older gospels. And as we talked about last week, there are lots of other gospels. They canonized the 4 of them. But as we talked about, there was Peter and Mary and the Aquarian and on and on. There were a whole bunch of Enoch. There were a whole bunch of gospels, but those 4 were the ones that put in. But the most famous, one of the most famous now, is the Gospel of Thomas, because of the age at which it was found. It was discovered in 1945. It was put into circulation in 1946. And wasn't really clearly understood and widely available until like the 1950s. So again, that is relatively young in the scheme of things. And so that's why people are still, it's such a controversial one. People are immersing themselves in to learn more about it. And why Egypt? Why not? Well, some speculate that it was written in Syria near Edessa, but we only have this version written in Coptic and found in Upper Egypt. And as we talked about Coptic is that last of the ancient Egyptian languages. The Coptic churches, as we said before, is one of those foundational churches, one of at the very beginning, which was founded in the 1st century. So when people pull that lie about, the Christianity is a white man's religion, that you're thankful you were slaves were brought over here, so you were exposed to Christianity, none of that is true, because these are all Afro-Asiatic people from the very beginning. And so this one particular one was found in Egypt, and the only other fragment of a piece found in a garbage dump was found in Egypt also. Um, Jews have been in Egypt for centuries, and they often found it a place of refuge and escape from later Roman persecution. We have the story of them being in bondage in Egypt, but in the Exodus story. But we know that they found a lot of sanctuary in Egypt also. When the Romans destroyed Jerusalem, the Egyptians weren't involved in that, and a lot of Israelis came down to Egypt for sanctuary. So even the family of Jesus did. When at his birth, when Herod was looking to see who this new king was and wanted to kill the newborn males, the family actually migrated down to Egypt. So, and Egypt also is uniquely has a climate that's dry enough, it's arid, and it's able to preserve some of these texts, especially those that have been buried and covered over in sand and so forth. So many of the other places could have been were too humid, and so the moisture, the dampness, and all those things would have destroyed this pretty fragile paper. But it was preserved there in Egypt. I'm going to play now. Thankfully, I can share stuff, my screen, something from one of the a noted scholar. Her name is Dr. Elaine Pagels. She's a professor at Princeton, and she's done a lot of work on the Gospel of Thomas. She was one of those originals who were immersed in it and helped with translations and all this sort of stuff. So she has written quite a bit on Gnostic Gospels, and in particular the Gospel of Thomas. And as we said, Thomas itself really is not a Gnostic Gospel. It's just a collection of Jesus' sayings. So let's see what Dr. Pagels has to say.
Much that you know from the New Testament, if you know those Gospels, you'd find in the Gospel of Thomas. But the other part of the Gospel of Thomas has sayings that we never knew, except some of them had been found. This is a fragment found in a garbage dump in Egypt. Egypt is one of the only places in the world that is so dry that papyrus doesn't rot. And so in the garbage dump, you can find wills and deeds and accounts and all kinds of stuff. But one of the things people found in the 1890s is this saying, which says, "These are the secret words which Jesus, the living one, spoke, and which his disciple Judas Thomas wrote down. And he said, whoever finds the meaning of these words will not die." We didn't know what the rest of those words, but when Jean Dorès, a French scholar, first went to Egypt to find out what was in these texts, because they were astonished to find there were actually a text that claims to be the secret teaching of Jesus, he read these lines as the opening lines. "These are the secret sayings which the living Jesus spoke, and which Didymus Judas Thomas wrote down." Now, if you know the Gospel of John, you know that Didymus Judas Thomas is mentioned there as one of the disciples. So it's attributed to a disciple of Jesus. But many people have thought these were heretical. So I just this is sort of silly, but here's the New Testament, here's the secret Gospels. Are they apples and oranges or rotten eggs? That is sort of the way they've been treated ever since the 2nd century, when Irenaeus of Lyon, one of my favorite bishops from the 2nd century, says, "Oh, well, the heretics say they have more gospels than there really are, but they only have gospels that are full of blasphemy and insanity, an abyss of madness and blasphemy against Christ," which I thought was kind of a priceless comment. And I must say, when my first book was published, Raymond Brown, who was then a prominent New Testament scholar, what they didn't know at the New York Times is that he was a Sulpician priest dedicated to the preservation of orthodoxy in religion, basically gave it a nice review and said she's a pretty good scholar, but she's been misled by Jason Epstein, her editor. I thought, wow, you don't even think these are my own ideas. But he says these gospels were rubbish in the 1st century, and they're still rubbish, so we don't have to worry about them. And our dear friend, Krister Stendahl, said to me more recently, "You know, Elaine, we used to think these gospels were just weird." And we did, because they didn't look like the ones in the New Testament entirely. So the first stage of research, when they were first discovered, the Gospel of Thomas was published by Henri Charles Puech and Pahor Labiv and Gilles Quispel, a French, Egyptian, and Dutch scholar. They published the Gospel of Thomas, and they said, well, what is this anyway? This can't be one of the real Gospels, which are written, say, between the period, maybe 40 years after the death of Jesus to 50 or 60 years within the first century. Say, well, this must be maybe twice as old, twice sort of, if the Gospel of Mark was written in the year 70, let's just say 140. This is obviously late and derivative, and that's what they wrote. It's a much later Gospel. However, when I was starting in graduate school, Helmut Kester was one of my professors, and he was studying the sayings of Jesus and how they were first preserved orally. And he began to say, wait a minute, some of these sayings look like very early versions of sayings that we find in Matthew and Luke. Maybe these are not the oldest, the most recent Gospels. Maybe these are they go back to the earliest list of sayings of Jesus. Maybe they were written, he said, as early as maybe 20 years after the death of Jesus, which would make them the earliest source of the teaching of Jesus. Much that you know from the New Testament, if you know those Gospels, you'd find in the Gospel of Thomas. But the other part of the Gospel of Thomas has sayings that we never knew, except some of them had been found. This is a fragment found in a garbage dump in Egypt. Egypt is one of the only places in the world that is so dry that papyrus doesn't rot. And so in the garbage dump, you can find wills and deeds and accounts and all kinds of stuff. But one of the things people found in the 1890s is this saying, which says, these are the secret words which Jesus, the living one, spoke, and which his disciple Judas Thomas wrote down. And he said, whoever finds the meaning of these words will not die. We didn't know what the rest of those words, but when Jean de Res, a French scholar, first went to Egypt to find out what was in these texts, because they were astonished to find there were actually a text that claims to be the secret teaching of Jesus, he read these lines as the opening lines. These are the secret sayings which the living Jesus spoke, and which Didymus Judas Thomas wrote down. Now, if you know the Gospel of John, you know that Didymus Judas Thomas is mentioned there as one of the disciples. So it's attributed to a disciple of Jesus. But many people have thought these were heretical. So I just this is sort of silly, but here's the New Testament, here's the secret Gospels. Are they apples and oranges or rotten eggs? That is sort of the way they've been treated ever since the 2nd century, when Irenaeus of Lyon, one of my favorite bishops from the 2nd century, says, oh, well, the heretics say they have more Gospels than there really are. But they only have Gospels that are full of blasphemy and insanity, an abyss of madness and blasphemy against Christ, which I thought was kind of a priceless comment. And I must say, when my first book was published, Raymond Brown, who was then a prominent New Testament scholar, what they didn't know at the New York Times is that he was a Sulpician priest dedicated to the preservation of orthodoxy in religion, basically gave it a nice review and said she's a pretty good scholar, but she's been misled by Jason Epstein, her editor. I thought, wow, you don't even think these are my own ideas. But he says these Gospels were rubbish in the 1st century, and they're still rubbish, so we don't have to worry about them. And our dear friend, Krister Stendahl, said to me more recently, Elaine, we used to think these Gospels were just weird. And we did, because they didn't look like the ones in the New Testament entirely. So the first stage of research, When they were first discovered, the Gospel of Thomas was published by Henri Charles Puech and Pahor Labiv and Gilles Quispel, a French, Egyptian, and Dutch scholar. They published the Gospel of Thomas, and they said, well, what is this anyway? This can't be one of the real Gospels, which are written, say, between the period, maybe 40 years after the death of Jesus to 50 or 60 years within the first century. Say, well, this must be maybe twice as old, twice sort of, if the Gospel of Mark was written in the year 70, let's just say 140. This is obviously late and derivative, and that's what they wrote. It's a much later Gospel. However, when I was starting in graduate school, Helmut Kester was one of my professors, and he was studying the sayings of Jesus and how they were first preserved orally. And he began to say, wait a minute, some of these sayings look like very early versions of sayings that we find in Matthew and Luke. Maybe these are not the oldest, the most recent Gospels. Maybe these are they go back to the earliest list of sayings of Jesus. Maybe they were written, he said, as early as maybe 20 years after the death of Jesus, which would make them the earliest source of the teaching of Jesus. So we started thinking in a very different way, and that was Helmut's hope, to find sort of the real Jesus speaking in this particular gospel. And that started a whole cottage industry of scholars looking for that.
So now she goes on, and I have the link to it in there, and you'll get all of this. And I want you guys to just leisurely be able to go through it and take your time, and because, as I said, she has a wealth of information to be able to share, and it brings a whole new perspective on it. And you see how the establishment, that white male establishment, didn't even want to accept scholarship from a white female. So you can imagine if it was a black female presenting anything, how they would have responded to it. But eventually, truth crushed will eventually rise, and they begin to see that no, if these sayings, many of them are in pieces in the Gospels that have been canonical, that have been included in there, but they add more to it. It was obvious then that they were sourced, those Gospels were sourced from this one. And that's what they were actually looking for, something called Q, for that source Gospel. We know that Mark of those in the Bible is the earliest, but apparently, as she said, there were a lot of oral traditions, there were a lot of stories that was written out. Jesus himself never penned anything, he never wrote anything down. It was all basically oral tradition. So I'm sure that's how they taught. That's how the rabbis taught. And it was not unusual to have secret teachings. There's no narrative in it, but there are some themes that arise, like that whole thing of secret teachings. And you may say, well, that sounds sort of sinister, but that was how rabbis taught. They taught, and Jesus was a rabbi, that he grew up in that Jewish tradition, and they talked about Jewish mysticism. And we'll talk about that in some later classes as we talk about the Kabbalah, which is connects to ancient Egyptian and Hindu and all those. They all have those same basic teachings, what Jesus called imperial rule, and what we more know as the kingdom of heaven or the kingdom of God. But that's what was referred to in those secret sayings back in that day as imperial rule, talking about the kingdom and how that imperial rule, the same thing we'd say, is within. He said, you will in no wise enter the kingdom of heaven unless you come as a child. He told the criminals that were executed on the cross with him, on this day you entered the kingdom of heaven. So he's talking about that kingship, kingdom, and it's the same as imperial rule. And there's also the whole concept that emerges in these about oneness of the individual. And you're going to see some sayings that sound a little wild, a little different, or a little weird, but when we put our metaphysical lens on them, they all seem to make sense because they're talking about the oneness of that person, the oneness of in Genesis, when it talks about male and female created he them. that we began from the beginning with that duality of us, of having the masculine and the feminine, the male and the female, the logical and the intuitive, the left and the right, the yin and the yang. And what we're searching always is to go back to that integration of those, so that we're in harmony, we're in balance, and we create that oneness again. And also the other thing is the oneness with God. Is one thing that happens, is that there's no separation. When Jesus talked about, when you see me, you see the Father, we are also part of that only begotten, that there's the oneship with us as well. And that begins to give you some keys, some clues as to why this gospel was repressed. Because if you have that oneness, that one connection with God yourself, there's no need for the intermediaries, the bishops and the Sadducees and the Pharisees and the high priests, the cardinals, the popes, and all those things. If you have that intimate connection yourself, it's more Abrahamic, where Abraham didn't have any of this stuff written down, but yet he had an intimate connection with God. And so if you have that oneness, you don't need all that other stuff that has been added to it. What's interesting is what's not mentioned in the Gospel of Thomas, because there is no narrative, but there's no even references to virgin birth, anything about Jesus's personal life, salvation, and how we've come to define it. Most of us don't even know saved from what, resurrection or Satan. So none of those things, those themes appeared in it. It's really more from a Jewish perspective of how do you live? What do you do? What's moral? What's ethical? And those types of things. And we'll see that in some of the sayings as well. And that's what the expectation was. How do we apply this stuff? Is this a new interpretation of Judaism, a new sect, a new piece of it? As I said last time, is it Judaism light? Is it something, the same thing rehashed? What is it? So you didn't see any of that. Basically, it was just a collection, and it's not in any real order. It's as if we were walked around and at some point we were copying down the words of Dr. B. And we said, well, this one time she said this. I remember Dr. B talking about this, and somebody wrote it down. Or you remember that time, Dr. Barbara, we were sitting around the coffee and she came and said this, and all those things. And people start pulling those pieces together, and we begin to put together a book called The Sayings of Dr. Barbara. We don't have any narrative on her growing up in Houston. We don't know anything about her overcoming TB. We don't know anything about her interactions with Johnny Coleman. We don't have any of that. We just have some of the words that she's saying. When she talked about piddling, and she talked about piddling quite a bit, but other people, they may not get that. But we, having been exposed to her, we understand the importance and significance of that. And we haven't recorded everything that she said. We recorded those things that stood out in her memory. And she said, baby, you got to do this. Some of those things she said to you as an individual. Some of those things were said to the congregation collectively. Some were said to just the ministers in a smaller setting. And some of those were said at her home. Some of this, so there were different occasions. Same thing with Jesus. And so these were just things that were put down, and they were ascribed to Thomas. Now, we don't know whether or not Thomas actually did these or not. We don't know whether Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John are the ones who actually wrote those, but they were given those. They were saying, well, we will fix that to them. And many of those things were added later on to give a little more clarity, to justify different perspectives, to validate some points and opinions. So we just sort of tend to look at the red letters, what Jesus said, and sort of glom onto those. Any thoughts, comments, or anything? Okay. So I wanted to give a lot of background on these because, as Dr. Pagels mentioned, there's only 114 of these sayings that are here. We could go through these in one day, with one session, really, because some of them are very short. There may be some one-liners in there. So we could, as you've seen from the PDF that I sent you, it's very compact. So it's not a whole lot in terms of the actual volume of stuff that's included. The thing is the freshness and newness of some of it that's never been seen before. And that's why we're sort of taking it piecemeal here, going through some of the commentary on it, other people's versionings of it. But as I said from the very beginning, nobody has any lock on the truth of it because it's all very much pretty new to us. So the first saying is, and he said, whoever finds the interpretation of these sayings will not experience death. I sort of relate that to 1 Corinthians 15:55, where it says, "O death, where is thy sting? O grave, where is thy victory?" As Paul was writing to the church at Corinth, that at some point, we know metaphysically and that there is no death per se, that we are already in eternity, that there's energy, and even the physicist will say that energy is never lost. It changes form. That's how you get water. You heat it up. It starts to bubble and boil. It evaporates as vapor. It goes up. It condenses. It hits the coldness of the clouds, and it can come down again as precipitation or snow or something. We never lost it. It just changes forms, and that's how we, as New Thought, true students, we believe that this energy that is us. John said it, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word eventually became flesh, and that's what we see, that we're on this journey as well. So when you have that perspective, it sort of takes the sting out of death. You know that those loved ones that we have are still with us, and as African peoples, we talk about connecting with the ancestors. If you went to see the Black Panther movie, you saw that when he was going and he could commune with the ancestors, and we still tap into that, allowing us to know that those who've gone before us are still there with us. We call it that chorus of witnesses, the shoulders on which we stand, and all those things are attesting to the fact that we tap into that spirit, and we also know that we will come again back in some form. If you check your Akashic records, you've seen that you've been this, you've been that, you've been thus, you've been all these things before. The Rosicrucians, they say, and I sort of accept that when we see different things, child prodigies that come forth, people maybe transgendered in some way or have different things, because there are pieces of us that bleed over. That it's not, we're not like a bulk eraser and completely wiped out all the time. There are those who come in and know higher math, never been exposed to it. They can compose, concertos and everything when they're in elementary school. So, and it's not something that we don't inherently or intuitively know already, because we just are sometimes afraid to put those terms on it, those labels on it. Reincarnation, that sounds like something that's spooky or the pseudo or whatever. But didn't Jesus ask his disciples, "Who do men say that I am?" And they responded, "Some say that you are Isaiah or one of the prophets." Literally, they were saying that you were reincarnated as somebody. The Dalai Lama. They say that they're the process when they are identifying who the Dalai Lama is. They're looking to see at that child, to see those characteristics, to test them and quiz them on things that they would not have known otherwise. And they go through that process to identify who that next Dalai Lama is going to be. So we know these things intuitively. Yes, Gail?
I was going to say, we... like you said, we know these things, and we also say these things, but how do you put it? Okay, it's just like like you said, when a child is born, the family gathers around and they look at him and say, "Oh, he looks like this person." Mm-hmm. Or if they, after a few months and he, does something, turns his head a certain way, looks up at you a certain way. "Oh, that's like, great aunt so-and-so used to do that." Mm-hmm. So we do that still to this day, but we don't acknowledge it.
And if they're a little precocious, we say, "Oh, they got an old soul."
Yes. Yes.
So, I mean, we don't even think about what we're saying. But that's what we're saying. So if we have that, then it's like if you, whoever finds the interpretations of these sayings will not experience death. And that's why we don't even bring the body into the sanctuary, because that body was just the clothing, the wrap, the house, this old building is what the old Baptists used to sing. This old building keeps on leaning. I got to move to a better home. So they've known that that body has been vacated and that spirit has gone on to something new. We don't know what we're going to appear like, but we know that we will be like you. It's like Paul was saying. We don't know, but we're familiar with these things. It's just like a baby coming into the world. They come in crying because they've left the safety and the comfort of the womb, entering into a different and new experience, a shocking and bright experience. And maybe it's the same thing for us. They always say that they go towards the light and all this sort of things. But so when you have that, maybe it gives you some comfort, some consolation. A lot of times at funerals, they go into John and say, I go to prepare a place for you. Where I am, there you may be also. And that brings people comfort in knowing that this may not be the final destination, the final voyage, and it's just the commencement, the beginning. It's not the end, it's the commencement, the beginning of our new experience. And we may come again in some other form. The Hindu believe it. The natives of just about indigenous people of just about every continent believe pretty much the same things. So there must be some truth into these. And so when we can tap into that, we will not experience death as we've been taught to experience it. And we experience it here. Our custom has been a lot of grieving, a lot of mourning, a lot of sadness and gnashing of teeth and wailing. You remember going back to the funerals back in the day. Seemed like they've gotten a little better, but back in the day, oh Lord, they took and that was that. You had all of that, and people were pretty exhausted and spent. I've gone to some funerals lately, and they've been a little bit more upbeat. They've talked about the positive, the homegoing celebration, and those types of things, and we've made it a little bit more palatable. So maybe as the consciousness continues to evolve, then we'll be more calm with this process of death also, so it loses its sting. I wanted to show another video to you. This one is by a guy named Webb, and I like the video pieces because I don't like you just hearing me chatter on and on all the time, and sometimes I wanted to expose you to some new sources, so beyond just me, you can go and listen to some of these things, watch him as well.
And he said, whoever discovers the meaning of these things won't taste death. Now, this is pretty simple, in that when you discover the truth of consciousness, you discover your true nature of existence. The existence that we have here in this human body is only us tuning into our true existence, which is in the field itself, the consciousness field. We have a portion of ourselves that exists beyond our body, and we are simply a physical manifestation and a physical experience of our consciousness, kind of tuning into our physical existence here. And so when you discover the reality that you exist beyond your body, then you discover that immortal portion of yourself, and thus you won't taste death, because you have discovered what is within you that transcends your body, transcends your death, and allows you to exist beyond. Because if you have the idea as a Christian that your spirit starts with this physical manifestation, you are woefully mistaken. Your spiritual existence existed before this thing came into being, and you simply tuned into this physiology. To say that your spirit exists only after this physical body comes into being is silly. And in fact, we'll see where Jesus mentions that later in the Gospel of Thomas. But you're tuning into that immortal existence from your body itself. So that's what Jesus is talking about when he says, whoever discovers the meaning of these things won't taste death.
Saying 2. Jesus said, let him who seeks continue seeking until he finds. When he finds, he will become troubled. When he becomes troubled, he will be astonished, and he will rule over the all. So we know that even the gospel talking about seek and you will find, knock and the door will be open unto you. That you have to have that attitude of wanting to know, of seeking to find, to uncover, before the truth can be revealed to you. But when he finds, he will become troubled. Because often when we find truth, it contradicts what we've been taught or what we've learned. And there becomes that, what they call it, cognitive dissonance that happens, where what you believe and what you've discovered, there's a dissonance that's happening, and then there becomes an uneasiness within you. Emily Cady called it chemicalization, that it stirs up some stuff within you because all your life you've been taught this, you believe this, your doctrine has said this, you've been instructed in this way, and it's become conditioned in you. But when you hear the truth, it can upset that apple cart. It can overturn those vendors in the temple. That's when Jesus literally went into the temple and overturned it. He's overturning things that happened within our consciousness, as well as we have bastardized what was happening there. That's what got Jesus upset, was that they were bringing commercialism into the temple. But sometimes we bring that in. We are the temple, though. We know that we are the temple, and we do some things that are not for our highest and greatest good in our temple. And sometimes when we are confronted with that, it's a little bit upsetting when the doctor tells you, well, your A1C is too high and you're going to have to cut back on this. It could be upsetting. Or your blood pressure's risen this high. That temple is not in alignment, and you got to do something different. You got to change some habits and lifestyle and behaviors. It can be upsetting, and then you can become troubled. But it's all about bringing ourselves into harmony. And I think that's what Jesus was referring to in there, that some of these patterns of belief that we've established, when we know the truth of why, what we're doing, that's what brought the establishment upon him. When the legalistic ones, the Pharisees and Sadducees, can argue about if you're working on the Sabbath, were your disciples violating the Sabbath by picking grain to eat when they were hungry? If you pull a donkey out of a ditch on the Sabbath, is that considered work? And all these things, they got so legalistic about the letter of the law, they lost the spirit of the law. And when Jesus challenged them by saying, all of the commandments can be summed up in loving God with all thy mind, thy heart, and thy soul, and loving thy neighbor as thyself. That boils it all down, and I ain't got to worry about me, what I'm doing, giving tithes over to you, or all these types of things. That upset the establishment because they had a vested interest in the status quo. When people were bringing you the tithes, you got the best of it. You ate from the fatted calves that they brought to you, and the lambs that they sacrificed, the burnt offerings. You got to control the treasury. All the taxes and taxation was brought to you. You lived a life of luxury, while the working class suffered. So they didn't want to upset the status quo. Who does? Power usually doesn't give up power easily. It has to be taken oftentimes, and that can be upsetting and disturbing. So I'll go back and see what he says about this second teaching.
Okay, so this is pretty straightforward. What Jesus is talking about here is the experience of enlightenment itself, the process of transcending your regular waking awareness existence into the non-local awareness, where your consciousness is expanded outward almost infinitely. Whoever seeks shouldn't stop until they find, meaning this is so important that you should not stop seeking it until you find enlightenment. And I told my son the exact same thing. Make this your number one goal in life, and do not stop until you find it. When they find, they'll be disturbed. Now, the reason they'll be disturbed is because the consciousness expansion experience brings into your awareness things that you had no idea exist, and it is overwhelming. The experience of infinity is overwhelming. And when you experience that, it is disturbing. It is, holy crap, I had no idea that my consciousness could expand out that far and be inclusive of that much information. It is, like I told it in my experience where I wrote about it in the Mind Hacking Happiness Blue Book. I explained it that the consciousness, the screen door of my consciousness, I think is what I said, was just about ripped off its hinges.
We go on to saying 3.
Hold up.
Hold up. Wait a minute.
All right.
No, I like that, Dale. That's perfect.
So this gentleman that just spoke, he is so what this is what you're doing. You're comparing, is that what you're doing? Comparing the sayings of Jesus with the saying of Thomas? Is that what that basically is?
Well, these
not basically, but
right. Well, these sayings from Thomas are supposed to be the sayings of Jesus.
Gotcha.
So all of them you will see either said Jesus said, he said, referring to Jesus, or you will have a disciple or apostle posing a question to Jesus that Jesus answered. And those are the basic forms throughout the whole, Gospel of Thomas. So all of these are like compiled sayings. So I wrote the sayings of Dr. B, and Gail wrote the sayings of Dr. B. Now, we were with Dr. B on different occasions, or somebody who traveled with her to Ghana is going to hear something that somebody who didn't travel, or whatever. So there is no one list. There must have been many lists of people, and there were a lot of oral traditions as well. People recited what they heard Jesus said, and then some scribe copied it down. And that's why it's not in narrative order. It's not chronological order. So that's basically we got this compilation, but we're almost certain there were others. Yes, Gail.
You said it wasn't in narrative, and as I was reading it, and I'm saying, well, dag, he just said, Jesus said blah 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 blah, whereas in the 4 Gospels they're saying, well, we were here, we were doing this and
right.
da da da, and then Jesus said da 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 da. So you got a whole storyline of what we were doing, where we were, we just had dinner, or things like that, or we visited Lazarus and blah blah blah, and Jesus said this at that time, and then we left. But Thomas didn't, according to this, Thomas didn't say all that. He just said, Jesus said, hey, seek and you will find. That's
right.
it. It's not that, that was part of his Sermon on the Mount or what have you. Just seek and you will find. So there was no narrative. So, in reading this, the Gospel of Thomas, you're saying, dang, should I really get into this? Because, with the 4 Gospels, I can, learn this and that. And I don't go into Paul. Paul is too far away.
There are lots of different perspectives on Paul. He's a controversial one. Yeah. I know the Shrine of the Black Madonna doesn't emphasize Paul in their, black nationalism, but there are many who do, because basically it's Paul's letters that established the foundation of the first churches. So but Paul never actually was there with Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
So.
But when this young man, Mr. Webb, was saying that you're not actually a Christian or doing the Christian belief, I was thinking, yes, he's right, because most churches are not doing Jesus, they're doing Paul.
Mm-hmm.
So everything is basically from Acts back, of Paul and Paul's sayings, and Paul, they might have slid in James and, things like that, but it's basically the teachings of Paul.
And in truth, they're not even adhering to Paul. they created all this new stuff that has nothing, like the newest thing is Christian nationalism. And that's why you see so many professed fundamentalist Christians who are advocating for the election of someone who is anti-Christian in all of his actions and professions, because they've come up with this thing that they try to equate Trump with Cyrus, who was the king of Persia, who allowed the Jews to return back into Palestine to rebuild the temple. So they're saying like, well, he wasn't one of us, but he's doing God's will, whether he knows it or not, type of thing. So they've got this convoluted rationalization for them to justify anything that's done, and to say that, well, he's not one of us, but he's doing what is required, that Jesus is with them. He's on a mission. And so that's why they can get so fundamentally locked in and are willing to kill you, because they say they are pro-life. So it's interesting how these people are not very Christ-like in the meaning of the word Christian. And I think that's what he was saying, that, you know, that what they're teaching has nothing to do with what Christ was teaching. Here's the third saying. Jesus said, if those who lead you say to you, see, the kingdom is in the sky, then the birds of the sky will precede you. If they say to you, it is in the sea, then the fish will precede you. Rather, the kingdom is inside of you, and it is outside of you. When you come to know yourselves, then you will become known, and you will realize that it is you who are the sons of the living Father. But if you will not know yourselves, you dwell in poverty, and it is you who are that poverty. Know thyself, we always go back to, it boils down to knowing who you are, whose you are, what you are. And if you're looking around hither and yon, like my mom used to go, running from pillar to post, you're not going to find it. You're looking for it in this guru. You're looking for it in this teaching. You're looking for it in this book. You're looking for it there. You're looking for it with this preacher. You're looking for it with this rabbi. You keep looking for those things, and you're not going to find it there, because you're already a part of it. You're not separated from it at all to begin with. You just have to allow yourself to remember and to reconnect, or your mind to reconnect, because you were never separated from it. So you don't have to go over here, go to there, that they got it, this church got it, this doctrine has it, this, this is the true word of God, and all that. None of us got everything, because nobody has a monopoly on truth. We all might gain little insights and pieces and put it all together, but you don't have to go hither and yon to find it. Any thoughts? Okay, let's see what Dr. Webb says about this one.
Saying 3. Jesus said, if your leaders tell you, look, the kingdom is in heaven, then the birds of heaven will precede you. If they tell you it is in the sea, then the fish will precede you. Rather, the kingdom is within you and outside you. When you know yourselves, then you will be known, and you'll realize that you're children of the living Father. But if you don't know yourselves, then you live in poverty, and you are the poverty. And this speaks directly to what we said just a few seconds ago, or a few minutes ago, when we were talking about the kingdom of heaven is your ability to tap into your consciousness and then spread out infinitely through tapping into the non-local field of consciousness, which is you. It is God, but it is a small portion of that is you, yet the field is inseparate. It is all one thing. And so when you tap through your body into your infinite consciousness, then there is no line of demarcation anymore. Like, there is an ability for your physiology to be able to handle a certain amount of information and a certain amount of access to the infinite field, to the limitations of your gray matter. And don't think that Jesus didn't understand exactly how the universe worked, including the physiology of the human body, when he started talking about how to tap into this non-local field of consciousness, this kingdom within, this God this inseparateness of the universe. Don't think he didn't know. You think the Son of God, from your perspective, is not going to understand exactly how the universe works and exactly how consciousness works within the human form? You're digging yourself a hole there. So what he's telling them, his followers, don't believe what anyone says about the kingdom of heaven. What he is saying is, if they tell you it's up in the sky, then the birds are going to beat you there. If they tell you out in the sea, then the fish are going to beat you there. It is not those things that they are pointing at. The kingdom is within you and outside you. So it is within you. You have to go within yourself to be able to discover it. And it's also outside you, meaning it's everywhere in the universe that you are not, but that which you are an inseparate part of.
And we are the poverty in the fact that it is our belief that constricts us and confines us to that. So when we can believe in the infinite possibility and the expansiveness of, the universe, then that's who we are. We are who we say we are. And that's why we have to be careful with our I am statements and saying, I am poor, I am tired, I am sick, I am this, I am that, I'm weak, I am worn, I am a wretch, I am all these things that we've been conditioned to say we are, and then we end up manifesting those things, expressing those things. Next saying 4. Jesus said, the man in old days will not hesitate to ask a small child 7 days old about the place of life, and he will live. For many who are first will become last, and they will become one and the same. And this part of Jesus has often talked about the first becoming the last, and he also talked about the coming to the kingdom as little children. And he says that an old man will not hesitate to ask a small child that's 7 days old, because we know there's something special about kids, these infants. They come as they come fresh into this world. As I said, there's some of that spirit realm is still with them. They don't know language, they don't know any of those things, but they're not a blank slate. They're coming with a lot of spiritual awareness and knowledge as well, that if we can attune ourselves to be like them, Jesus said we have to become like them in order to enter that kingdom of heaven. They don't have an ego. They're open to learn. They're willing to learn anything. They're trusting. They're all these things that we lose as we grow older. We add cynicism. We doubt and fear and all these things from our experiences we begin to add on to that. We begin a callousness that makes us distant and not willing to be in touch with those initial feelings, because we think we're developing some sort of sense of protection. But these kids at that point, they're open to understand and learn. You can teach a child, different parents can talk to them in different languages, and they'll grow up knowing those languages because they've taken in and absorbed it all. The child is born in China, it's going to learn Mandarin or Cantonese, depending on what part of it's in. Over here in America, we may learn some pieces of English, have trouble with that. So it all depends on where you are as to what you can assimilate. And we know that there are kids in Africa who are learning tribal languages as well as the colonizers' language, as well as, they can speak 4 and 5 different languages by the time they're adults with ease. They go in between them. You can see it in South Africa. People are speaking in Bantu and Zulu and Twi and everything else, and going to English and then Afrikaans, and they're just easily able to do it, and we'll start struggling trying to get the one down. So if we can become like kids, like children, then we're open, and that's how that first becomes last, and the last becomes first.
What Jesus is talking about here is, and this is going to be a challenge for a lot of Christians, the spiritual existence that you have sometimes comes back more than once. And the 7-day-old baby is going to be somebody coming into a brand new life. And so a person asking a 7-day-old baby about the place of life, they understand that that baby is coming brand new into existence from the kingdom of heaven that holds all souls, all subsets of the data that create the entire field that we become as an experience when we start to divide and subset into the little pieces of the non-local field of consciousness.
Jesus said, recognize what is in your sight, and that which is hidden from you will become plain to you, for there's nothing hidden which will not become manifest. We always said what's done in the dark will come to light, that type of thing. So you can't get away with anything because it's all going to be exposed one way or another. The truth will come to light in some way or another. And I'm going to jump over to 6 because we're going to run out of time. His disciples questioned him and said to him, do you want us to fast? How shall we pray? Shall we give alms? What diet shall we observe? Jesus said, do not tell lies. Do not do what you hate, for all things are plain in the sight of heaven. For nothing hidden will not become manifest, and nothing covered will remain without being uncovered. So the end of saying 6 is like the saying 5 itself. It's like that same message. But as I said before, they were looking to see not so much what is heaven or what is salvation or what are any of those things. They were looking just for some plain things, like when they asked, well, teach us to pray as John also taught his disciples. How should we pray? Should we fast? Is that something we need to do? They're looking for some sort of structure and order on how to do these things. So again, it's his disciples questioned him and said to him, do we fast? So as you see, it's disciples who are asking the question because they're looking for some religious structure. Is this a new religion that we have? Well, how do we define it? We know that these people don't eat pork, and they circumcise, and they do this, and they give sacrifice, they do these things. So we know how to do these. These people over here, they do this, and they do the third, and they have human sacrifice, and they do this. These people over here, they have orgies, they do this. What do we do? They're trying to figure out, how do they define themselves? Who are we? And so they were just looking for some practical instruction. So he breaks it down and makes it very practical. Do not tell lies. Do not do what you hate. Sam Wilson always says, do what brings you peace. And that's one of the lessons that I learned from him, and I often go back to it. Do what brings you peace. Don't be, your motivation shouldn't be out of fear, out of compulsion, that somebody's demanding that you do it or any of those things, but you feel good about yourself and doing what you're doing. I'm not loving you out of an obligation to love you, because then you're going to have some resentment for it. But I'm doing what is natural to me. I'm forgiving you because I'm really forgiving myself. And I don't want to carry this burden of having a grudge or hating or being angry or any of those things, because it's only eating me up. So Sam just coined it in something that is simple for me to take with me, do what brings you peace. So those are the first 6 sayings of Jesus that we've gone through. Again, there are only 114 in total, and some are repeated. Some, like we just saw, were saying 6 contained. Some are saying 5, because even when ministers, they're giving a sermon, a lot of times they'll say a lot of the same thing. Their basic sermon may be the same. The lesson, people teaching their lesson may be the same, but they don't always repeat it exactly the same way. Sometimes they expand upon it with more examples in one time, and then sometimes they give it short and concise. The difference between when you're giving a little 5-minute sermonette versus when you got an hour-long teaching that you're giving. So it's same thing with Jesus. He said some things in public, then he said some things in private when they were huddled. And so that's what we're going to discover when we go through this. Also, we're going to discover that many of the disciples were actually women that were with him. They only acknowledged those who were the men, but Mary and Mother Jesus and many others were also there with him, and they were exposed to these same teachings as well. So any other thoughts and comments as we conclude this lesson portion for today?
This is Cindy. I'm just blown away by all this stuff. I grew up Catholic,
Okay.
and I grew up knowing that the priest had the answer for me. And it took me a minute to really know that, when I came to Hillside, it was like, oh, the answer's within me.
Mm-hmm.
I did listen to Dr. Barber, but she told me how to get that answer within me. And so it's taken me a while to do that, but I get this, and these are all amazing. I have to go down my Bible and look and see. But thank you for this class. It's like very eye-opening.
Oh, you're very welcome. And Taya, I see you had a comment. It's been written that it was Thomas who brought esoteric teachings to the Eastern countries. It might actually be the other way around. That Thomas brought the gospel of Jesus to the India and the Eastern countries, and he's still acknowledged. There's a monastery there in India. But a lot of what Jesus taught is actually, as we saw, is similar to what the Buddha taught. You could in some ways say that Jesus was a Buddhist, that Jesus was immersed in the Egyptian schools, ancient schools, wisdom schools. He studied in Persia. All of these things are speculated on those 18 years when Jesus was not documented. There was no narrative of him in our canonized Bible. But there is quite a bit of tradition and history that says that he did visit those other places. And even if you go look up Issa, I-S-S-A, there's a Saint Issa that was in that region that we were told about in India, where they document this kid coming from Palestine at the age of 14, staying till he was about 29, and that he had this special anointing and everything, and learned the yogic traditions, healing, and all those things that Jesus is said to have done. Yogis are said to be able to do those things as well. So it is interesting that the only real physical documentation comes from a source outside of Palestine. So Thomas did go back over to India, and that's where he was supposed to have died, there in India as well. So he's still revered there in India. Were there any other questions or comments I missed? Because I couldn't see them all as I was getting on.
Eunice?
Yeah, when I was just listening to this, it came to mind, like I do a lot of interviewing with people, and sometimes when you ask them a question, they always have to give you a build up to the answer. Mm-hmm. And so as I was listening to everyone talking, I'm simple like Thomas, just get to the point.
Cut to the chase, straight no chaser.
Straight to the chase. And that's it, even at work sometimes, that can be perceived that, hey, she might have had a little tone in it, but I don't have a lot of fluff for you. So I like Thomas. You just like, hey, this is what he said. Right. I don't have no build up for it. So thanks for sharing these. I can really resonate. It's great.
Oh, awesome. And that is the thing. I'm not going to give you any narrative fluff. I'm not going to tell you any of the context. He said this. You take it and you deal with that. And whatever it means to you, then that's cool. I'm good with it.